Good people, great people, God's people. How y'all feeling today, man? How y'all feeling? How y'all feeling? How y'all feeling? It's your boy, Professor Odie, and we back for another episode of The Antidote. Now, hope everybody's feeling good. Hope everybody's had a great weekend. Hope everybody's week was productive. Mine was all right. You know what I'm saying? We here, we good. And today's episode is going to be very interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, it's probably going to be one of my more controversial episodes because whenever I drop this type of ideology into the ethos, into you know, the social media spheres, I always get flack for what it is that I say and how it is that I say it from different types of people, right? Whether it be folks making 2.5 hour YouTube videos of me or from my own cohort of folks from, the black manosphere challenging me to produce particular evidence, which I will get to, shout out brother Obsidian. But this is a more general breakdown of what it is that I mean when I say black women desire for black men to be more like white men, and black black men desire black women to be more like white women. And when I say things like this, or when I say stuff like, black men have a tendency to pattern their masculinity around white patriarchy, or, the soft life in the way that it is marketed through particular lenses for black women, is just white femininity painted black, people get up in arms. And I'm like, hey, I didn't say that everybody did it. I said that we have a tendency to lean towards these things, and the reason being is because when we think of tradition, when we think of traditions or traditional in the United States of America, we have to understand that we as black people have been exposed overwhelmingly to white traditions. We have been exposed overwhelmingly to white ideological contextualizations, and we have been exposed overwhelmingly to how it is that white people perceive black people, and then how it is that we as black people have adapted to not only being perceived in this way, but being locked out of particular sociological, sociological mobility from engaging in and asserting our blackness in such a way where we are creating our own socio-cultural identity and our own socio-cultural self-understanding. Now, Odie, why do you say this, and what does this have to do with the episode title, which is A Modern Tradition? Well, once again, whenever we think about traditional, and in a lot of different ways, the way in which we contextualize traditional is based upon 19th century gender norms, right? And not only just 19th century gender norms, but 19th century European gender norms that come from the Victorian era, right? And a lot of these gender norms identify men and women as diametrically opposed to one another. Whereas men are supposed to be in the public sphere doing political things, engaging in manual labor, or engaging in work that generates income, whereas women are supposed to handle the home sphere. Women are supposed to handle child raising. Women are supposed to handle all of these different types of things. And that is the way in which we have become accustomed to this tradition of gender role ideology that even if we do not engage in, a number of us verbalize an aspiration to, right? So when we talk about 21st century ideology, or when we talk about 21st century conversation, a lot of our conversations as black people do not reflect our realities as black people, which is the reason why I say a number of us aspire to engage in these white ideological gender norm dynamics, or white ideological sociocultural norms, right? So a lot of the conversations that we have within the black, whether it be the Twitter sphere, the IG sphere, YouTube, black social media, and black media overall, there is this pedestalizing of the idea of the male as the sole provider, the woman as the sole nurturer in a household that is financially supplemented by the man, so that women either have the opportunity to engage in the lifestyle of being able to be soft and comfortable, and if children come into the picture, they are the primary nurturers of these said children. Even though we as black people historically have not ever engaged in this dynamic, a lot of us have conversations around aspiring to identify with this type of dynamic, right? So whenever we talk about traditional masculinity or traditional femininity, well, in academic literature it's identified as normative femininity. A lot of these things come from, once again, European 19th century idealized gender roles and gender norms. And these things identify how it is that we relate to one another, or more poignantly as it relates to black people, how it is that we've been taught to frame or contextualize one another at times to our detriment, right? So the idea or the conversation is around what does commitment, family, and roles look like when we stop attempting to mimic or aspire to these particular things. Now, here's the reason why I said I get a lot of flack, or here's the reason why I said I get a lot of pushback when I begin talking about these things. Because a number of us as black people, we are so used to being criticized, or we are so used to being seen as deficient, or we are so used to being seen as an incomplete version of a white person, which, once again, rightfully so, historically accurate and anthropologically reinforced, right? But if this is the reality of the situation, and if we as black people are seeking to construct our own socio-cultural and political ideology, if we are seeking to create our own communities, if we are seeking to create strong black families, we have to examine how it is that whiteness has intersected our development and our assertion of blackness, right? So I've had a number of conversations between black men and black women about what it means to engage in relationships from the perspective of the expectation that their partner essentially aspire to these particular gender norms or these particular gender norm aspirations, right? And once again, some of the responses that I get in return is, oh, why is it that we as black people have to accept less? Or why is it that we as black people need to accept things the way that it is that they are? I want you all to identify how those two things are different in terms of syntax, right? Why is it that we as black people need to accept less? Within even that response, we are identifying black attributes, or we are identifying black socio-cultural norms as less than. We are internalizing this idea that because we are practicing blackness, or because we are practicing what it is that it means to be black, we are engaging in some type of deficiency. And that is the core of the challenge that I am getting at. That is the core of the challenge that I am identifying. Why do we identify, or why have we internalized blackness as it exists, or blackness as it has existed, as detrimental? And that is one of the evidence pieces of our internalization of white norms, or the internalization of white socio-cultural norms as being better than blackness. Oh, my bad, microphone. Or being better as black socio-cultural norms, right? So another piece of this evidence, or another piece of this behavioral contextualizing, is when we begin talking about blackness, or when we begin identifying black culture. And there are a number of black people who identify black culture as simply being ghetto, as simply being lower class, as simply engaging in behaviors that are identified with, once again, all of the different types of negative stereotypes that you can associate with both black men and black women. This internalization, and once again, this minimization of blackness to just this particular socio-cultural behavior is by design. Once again, this is the reason why I said anthropologically supported. It is not necessarily that these things are in totality accurate. It is the way in which we have been turned, and we have been leaned, and we have been identified to see ourselves through once again, a white traditional norm lens. We have been taught to see that our own cultural practices and our own cultural engagements are minimized and limited to the shit that makes black people look bad. That is how it is that we have been taught. That it is how it is that we have been contextualized, not only just within ourselves, but within the greater culture of the United States. right? So for us, what does it mean for us to radically discard this idea that blackness is equivalent to lesser? What does it mean for us to discard this idea specifically within our own socio-cultural dynamic that blackness is lesser? Well, the first thing is, if you all want me to be extremely honest, we have to be very clear about how it is that in a number of different ways, us as black men and black women have been taught to despise and to denigrate or denigrate one another. We have. We have been taught that each of us exist in a perpetually deficient model, right? So if we think about how it is that black men identify black women, they identify them as hypersexual, they identify them as loud, they identify them as lacking femininity, they identify them as terrible mothers, they identify them as only being able to be fucked and not married. All of these different things are how it is that a number of black men identify black women. Once again, I'm saying a number. I'm not saying that all black men identify black women this way. I'm saying that a number of us identify black women this way. Similarly, with black women, a number of black women identify black men as ain't shit. They have no ambition. They lack the ability of direction. They have no ability to engage in leadership dynamics. They lack a particular level of intelligence, which is the reason why they don't go to college. These are all conversations that happen within the spaces of black men and black women that come from, once again, historically and anthropologically, I can trace these things back to the way that it is that founding fathers of the United States, individuals who have engaged in the science of evolution, people who have identified anthropology, people who have supplemented the science of psychology. All of these things are historical, all of these things are anthropological, and all of these things are readily available for you to find, right? So I'm going to give you all an example. There is a book, or one of my books. It's called African Psychology in the American Context, right? When we begin talking about how it is that we as black people have consistently been contextualized in the United States of America, right? When we begin identifying what it means for us as black people to have been identified as, once again, a perpetual deficient or a perpetual incompletion, right? One of the most, I guess you could say, one of the most popular or one of the most pervasive identities of black people are black people, once again, this is one from Carl von Linnaeus, right? So Carl von Linnaeus, early charting of racial distinctions. Carl von Linnaeus was a scientist, he was an anthropologist, and I believe that Carl von Linnaeus was also an individual who worked in the spaces of evolution, right? So, racial groups and racial breakdowns. We have Homo americanus, which is red and brown people, so these would be your Native Americans and Indians. They're reddish, choleric, erect, tenacious, contented, free, ruled by custom, right? Homo europaeus is white. White, ruddy, muscular, stern, haughty, stingy, ruled by opinion, right? Homo asiaticus, yellow, melancholic, inflexible, light, invented, ruled by rights. Homo afro, black, phlegmatic, which means full of mucus, indulgent, cunning, slow, negligent, ruled by caprice, right? So once again, black, phlegmatic, indulgent, cunning, slow, negligent, ruled by caprice, right? So these are pervasive ideas that have come through the provision of white sciences. These things have come through the provision of white traditions, right? These framings that we utilize in order to see one another as black people are not things that are by accident. These things that we say about one another are not by accident. They are by design, right? Another book that I have, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, right? Same concept. It is the framing of how it is that we as black people have been identified within the United States and how it is that we have been systematically dehumanized, right? So How were slaves to be figured into each state's population count? Once again, this is how we get to the idea of the perpetual deficient. If we've ever heard of the 3/5 clause, right? This quote above is an example of an attempt at resolving the problem. The main thrust of Madison's argument, once again, Madison, the president of the United States, is that slaves should be considered property for tax purposes and individuals for the purpose of determining a state's population. He goes on to explain how it is that slaves are both persons and property, right? He goes on to explain how it is that slaves are both persons and property. The agreed upon solution to this problem was the 3/5 compromise. Rather than each slave being counted as a full person, 3/5 of a state slave's population would be counted towards that total population. In this way, slaves became 3/5 of a human, right? So once again, when we begin identifying how it is that we as black people have been systematically dehumanized, and historically dehumanized, the way in which we have been taught to identify one another traditionally, right? Traditionally has been mired by this contextualization of whiteness. It has been mired by this idea that, once again, we are perpetually deficient, whether it be black men or black women, right? This is not just for American blackness. This is a global engagement, right? Africans were among the many civilizations around the world who did not live up to European standards and so were considered inferior. They were inferior first because they were not European, and second because they were not Christian. Thus, Africans were viewed as impure, irreligious, and uncivilized, fit to be slaves, right? So, once again, this is from Thomas Jefferson. It is not against experience to suppose that different species of the same genus or varieties of the same species may possess different qualifications. Will not a lover of natural history then, one who views the gradations in all the races of animals within the eye of philosophy, excuse an effort to keep those in department of man as distinct as nature has formed them? This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of those people. Advance it therefore as a suspicion only that blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to whites in the endowments of body and mind. The consistent framing of one another, black men to black women and black women to black men, as somehow inferior, and then utilizing our current behavior. Once again, this is the reason why I said in my most previous episode that without the contextualization of us being black, we consistently overlook how it is that traditionally, the tradition of the United States has been to consistently make black people ineffective. Not by way of their blackness, but by way of creating environments in which black people cannot be effective, right? This is the tradition of the United States. This is how it is that we as black people have been engaged with by the United States. And this is factual. This is historically accurate. Everything that we experience as black people from this point moving forward, from that point of tradition moving forward, exists mainly in two ways. Number one, adaptive or maladaptive behavior patterns that seek to reinforce the stereotypes that we see about one another. That's number one. Or number two, the identity formation away from blackness that then, as a reference point, utilizes whiteness, white socialization, and white ideologies as the point of reference by which to aspire to. That is how that comes to be, right? And once again, within these contextualizations, we do have black people who continue to be progressive in the way of, voting in terms of, in the most previous election that 80% of black men and 92% of black women voted for Kamala Harris. But even within that space, there are still black people individually or microcosmically who expect one another to perform, whether it be respectability politics, whether it be economic viability that places other people at a disadvantage, whether it be engaging in nucleic family values, thereby abandoning the community. All of these things, once again, historically, anthropologically, are white oriented and white supremacist ideologies, right? Now, Odie, what does this have to do with us as black people expecting ourselves to behave in a way that's white aligned? Two things. Number one, as it relates to gender role constructs, as it relates to the idea of traditional gender roles, as it relates to the idea of traditional family values, when we speak of tradition, the traditions that we speak of are traditions as black people that we have put together based upon our experiences in the United States, which means that a number of these traditions within them have white characteristics, right? Haki Madhubuti in the book, Black Men, Single, Dangerous, and Obsolete, they call it seasoning. In the book, African Black Psychology in the American Context, they call it the Ma'afa, right? Joy DeGruy calls it post-traumatic slave syndrome. Irrespective of what it is that we call it, the way in which we have adapted our behaviors to identify and engage in proximity to whiteness in order to identify ourselves as black people who are not going to cause any trouble, or black people who are made to engage in the assimilation of these cultural practices so that we are seen as safe and not revolutionary or not radical, is still very much so present. It is still very much so in our collective psyches. Why? Because black people who practice radical blackness, historically, once again, the campaigns against them have been to jail, have been to harm, have been to dismantle, or have been to kill. Once again, to jail, to harm, to dismantle, or to kill. So, psychologically and behaviorally, there is a desire to not be seen as threatening. There is a desire to not be seen as somebody who will rock the cultural boat. But for us as black people to carry these things, it creates neurological and biological feedback in our bodies that manifests as stress. It manifests as a difficulty to reduce weight. It manifests as a difficulty to get rest. It manifests as a difficulty to engage in leisure activities. It manifests as a difficulty to reduce addiction. It manifests as a difficulty to trust each other. It manifests as a multitude of, once again, maladies that we see within the black community that we tend to blame one another for, instead of understanding how it is that operating in a hostile environment perpetuates maladaptive behavior. Black men at times expect black women to behave like white women because it is safe. At times, black women expect black men to behave like white men because it is safe. There are benefits, whether they be political, whether they be economic, whether they be the perception or the illusion of safety. These are the benefits. A loud, brash black woman does not challenge the conventions of whiteness. A self-assured, self-directed, and entrepreneurial black man, a loud, brash, and confrontational black woman does challenge the conventions of whiteness. A self-assured, assertive, self-directive, and economic or entrepreneurial black man does challenge the conventions of whiteness. But once again, person to person, these things feel diminutive, right? These things feel destabilizing. These things feel too radical. These things feel dangerous. We as black folks have a difficult time trusting one another because we, in proximity of one another, have seen how it is that we behave as it relates to survival. We have seen how it is that each other behave as it relates to pushing back against the supposition that we are supposed to behave in a particular way. We as black people have a difficulty trusting one another because, once again, our collective identity in blackness has consistently been disrupted by the strategic implementation of whiteness within our particular spaces. For every single iteration of blackness after the emancipation, there has been a correlating, interrupting, state-sanctioned or government-sanctioned disruption by white power structures. All of these things together create this idea that our traditions as blackness, or our traditions in blackness, whether it be collectivism, whether it be extended kinship, whether it be grassroots organizing, whether it be the teaching of our own histories, whether it be the assertions that whiteness can be disruptive and dangerous to black psyches, all of these different things are black cultural artifacts that a lot of us tend to let go of because they are too radical. Those are also our traditions. The tradition of self-determination, the tradition of collective identity, the tradition of extended kinship, right? This is my play cousin, this is my play auntie, this is my godfather. All of these different things are inherent within blackness. They are inherent within the things that we have carried over from Africanity. All of these things are also our traditions, right? The concept of resilience, the concept of being with one another as much as we are around one another. I said it before, we are losing recipes and we are losing the plot because of the desire to be aspirationally safe. The desire to be aspirationally in the middle, white, right? The aspiration to engage in whiteness from the perspective that we believe that it will allow us to be safer in our blackness. We may not say these things out loud. We may not say these things collectively, but we know it. We know, right? I've asked this question before because I have not seen this question be asked prior to me asking it. I asked this question on the 3 Milli podcast. I said, yo, have we ever sat and asked ourselves how it impacted our collective psyches as black people to consistently watch our leaders be assassinated? Specifically for black men. Specifically for black men, right? Have we collectively asked ourselves as black people how it felt and how we were psychologically impacted to watch a generation of black men be stolen through the war on drugs and through COINTELPRO? Have we ever sat and asked ourselves that question? Have we sat and genuinely processed that trauma? Have we? Have we processed the collective trauma of having parts of our history that continue to identify how dangerous it is at times to be black, a la the 1984, the 1985, I'm sorry, see, once again, I'm unsure of the year, but the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, right? And for those of you who are unaware, the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia was, once again, a state-sanctioned anti-terrorist plot to remove and push out and dismantle a Back to Africa movement that was based upon, once again, traditions of blackness, self-determination, collectivism, and self-defense. Which, to be quite fair, all of these things are political by nature. All of these things are self-asserting within blackness by nature. The MOVE bombing put black men, black women, and black children in harm's way. Simply because these black people dared to assert themselves against a white power structure? Have we ever sat and asked ourselves how that has impacted our collective psyche? What does it mean to affirm ourselves within a state of pure blackness? What does it mean to go through our black collective timeline and begin identifying how it is that the intersection of whiteness has created disruption? Have we sat and asked ourselves that question, right? In the book, Black Men, Single, Dangerous, and Obsolete by Haki Matabuti, he asks the question, or rather, he makes the assertion, and I got the book right here because y'all know I'm always gonna have a book, right? He makes the assertion that the reason why it's so difficult to find studies on black malehood or black masculinity is because to publish such studies would be in direct opposition to white interests, right? And that's the reason why, once again, when I have these conversations around black men or how it is that black men can improve or what it is that black men can do, I am coming from the perspective that we have difficulty asserting our blackness as black men, not because we don't want to, but because it is an unspoken understanding that this type of engagement, this type of exercising and practicing, this type of black tradition is dangerous. It is dangerous, right? So, Odie, all of these conversations do not sound like rejecting white traditions, or they do not sound like rejecting white patriarchy, or they do not sound like rejecting white gender norms. They are, because white masculinity is built on the back of black masculinity, and white femininity is built on the back of black femininity. Once again, historically, anthropologically, and traditionally, that is how that has happened. That is how that has gone. To reject, to wholly and radically reject the idea that blackness is a consistent inferior, to wholly and to militantly, as Bell Hooks put it, reject the idea that blackness consistently needs to be perpetuated in the media as a consistent and dynamic. So consistent means continuing and dynamic means moving, but it does not go above a point of detriment. It does not go above a point of disruption. It does not go above a point of being the stereotype. That is not a black tradition. That is not wholly rejecting these things, wholly rejecting the idea that being black is detrimental, wholly rejecting the idea that being black, whether it be a black man or a black woman, is somehow inferior, and then being able to check each other, being able to engage with one another in such a way where we hold each other accountable to not upholding this idea, but also consistently asking ourselves, how did we get to this point of looking at a black woman and saying, you're masculine, you're too much? Getting to a point where we're looking at a black man and saying, you ain't shit, and there's nothing that you can do to ever make you be shit. How did we get to this point? White norms and traditions. Not wholly internalizing black traditionalism, a part of black traditionalism, as asserting being a black radical in the sense of bucking this, once again, anthropological, historical, and traditional idea that is perpetuated through whiteness, through media, through systematic racism, that blackness as an entirety is only the maladaptive forms of blackness. That is what I mean when I say a modern tradition. That is what I mean when I say we as black people need to adopt this radical and this militant ideology of seeking out and disrupting constantly the idea that blackness, whether it be black womanness or black maleness or black manness or black manhood, is somehow perpetually deficient. This does not mean that we do not hold each other accountable this does not mean that we consistently criticize the way in which we present. That's not what it means. What it means is that we genuinely ask ourselves as black people, what does it mean to be a black man? What does it mean to be a black woman? And how do we consistently define ourselves outside of how it is that we have been given these frameworks to define ourselves? Because once again, if you as a black woman have a consistent perception that black men ain't shit, you're being anti-black. If you as a black man have a consistent perception that black women are hyper-masculine, you are being anti-black. Why? Because once again, anthropologically, I can trace these framings back to people who had an investment in the detriment, the enslavement, and the consistent denigration of black people. That is the modern tradition. That is how we diminish. That is how we repudiate. That is how we disrupt the idea of white patriarchy, the idea of white collectivist ideas of colonialism. This is how we repudiate racism, right? Because once again, black masculinity and black femininity were removed in order to justify the dehumanization of black people overall, so that white masculinity and white femininity could stand on top of it. That's how that went, right? So, once again, back to Haki Manabuti, black men, single, obsolete, and dangerous, right? So, black men in the United States are virtually powerless, landless, and moneyless in a land where white manhood is measured by such acquisitions. Most African Americans have been unable to look at their lives in a historical, racial, political, economic context. Thereby, without the proper tools to analyze, many black men have defined their lives as black duplicates of the white male ethos. The problem is that black men in relationship to black women cannot, a great majority of the time, deliver the American dream. Therefore, the dream is often translated into a black male/female nightmare where black men, acting out of frustration and ignorance, adopt attitudes that are not productive or progressive in relationship to black women, i.e. many black men end up treating or trying to treat black women like white men treat white women. The political and sexual games that exist in most cultures of the world that are largely demeaning and disrespectful to women become, due to a lack of self-definition, black men's games also, right? Few black scholars or activists have given serious attention to the condition of black men. There are many reasons for this. Number one, much of the published scholarly work on black people is by black men, and many of them do not see the importance of public self-analysis. Once again, much of the published scholarly work on black people is by black men, and many of them do not see the importance of public self-analysis. There is no reason to analyze myself because I'm a man. I said this in another podcast episode a couple of seasons back. I said, I said it in the TikTok. I said, most psychological studies or most studies that have been done in the United States of America have been done by white men on everybody else. Scholars tend to mirror that same procedure. Academia historically has been racist and exclusionary. It has not been inclusionary. It has not been appropriately inclusionary up until the last 60 years. We have a much longer way to go before academia is consistently inclusionary, consistently intersectional, and does not utilize a deficiency-based lens in order to examine black and non-white populations. Long way to go, right? But once again, much of the published scholarly work on black people is by black men, and many of them do not see the importance of public self-analysis, right? Even one of my folks in the black ministry, once again, shout out Brother Obsidian, he said that a number of black men do not wish to examine themselves in the public eye. Why? Is it simply because we are men? Or does it lean into this idea that, once again, placing ourselves into the space of public opinion will make us more vulnerable to these stereotypes and these diminutive actions? Once again, in an African-centered context, in an African-centered tradition, the problems of the community belong to the community. The community come together to discuss these things, whether it be through roundtables, whether it be through community, however it is that they came together to discuss these things, they came to the community center to discuss these things. Nobody was exempt from this community evaluation. Nobody, irrespective of gender. Gender did not exempt you, right? It is easier to get studies on black women or the black family published. Few black male scholars wish to wash dirty clothes in public. And the other side of that is if the black male situation is accurately assessed. It also means for the intelligent scholars and activists to clean up their own acts, right? Many of the scholars and activists are actually functioning in their personal lives contrary to the best interests of black people. And finally, studies that bring clarity and direction to the black male situation as an integral part of the black community or family are unpopular, not easy to get published, and are very dangerous. I want you all to pay attention specifically to number 5. I'm going to read it again. Studies that bring clarity and direction to the black male situation as an integral part of the black family / community are unpopular, not easy to get published, and very dangerous. Too many African American scholars have looked at the black situation in America from a European sociological framework, and in doing so, their work has been instrumental in distorting reality and exists as a body of negative ammunition to secure faculty positions in publishing contracts, and it is ego-greased for their warped worldview and sense of importance. Ladies and gentlemen, I will say this one more time, right? We as black people tend to practice white supremacist traditions because the proximity to whiteness gets us paid, right? The proximity to whiteness gets us identified. Once again, Cole et al., black woman and white women's perspectives on femininity, right? Taken together, these mean differences. So they did a study of 1,150 individuals collected by phone survey, and they asked both black women and white women their perspectives on femininity and feminism. The perspective or the foundation of the study was to identify how it is that women, both black women and white women, engaged in what it is that we identify as normative femininity or traditional femininity. And once again, coming from that gender role perspective of what traditional femininity is, it is to be pretty. It is to be fit, feminine, and friendly, as the denizens of the manosphere and the black manosphere say. It is to be the nurturer. It is to be the homemaker. All of these different things, right? Once again, anthropologically, historically, and sociologically, these things, as we know them, come from 19th century European Victorian values, right? Are y'all seeing the connections? Okay. It says, taken together, these mean differences suggest that black women were more interested than their white counterparts in traditionally feminine behaviors such as wearing attractive clothing and decorating their homes, yet they were more likely to describe themselves as feminists. You can be outwardly progressive and inwardly conservative. I'm going to say that one more time. You can be outwardly progressive and inwardly conservative. Because that conservatism, once again, anthropologically, historically, and sociologically, traditionally, in the United States of America, that conservatism has been used to justify the binary between who is human and who is not. That tradition, radically for black people, needs to be disrupted. Because, once again, historically, anthropologically, and sociologically, the tradition of the United States has been to utilize this binary in order to dehumanize black people. Our modern traditions cannot include these things because they are axiologically And they are diametrically opposed to our existence. They are diametrically opposed to our blackness. So then, Odie, what is the solution? What is the way forward? How do we stop, or how do we develop a modern tradition? What does this look like? Right? First of all, recognizing that blackness is not a consistent and dynamic diminutive property. I'm going to say that one more time. Radically rejecting the idea that being black in all of its forms is somehow inferior to whiteness. That's number one. Number two, being able to accept the reality that being black and asserting your blackness, whether it be in malehood or womanhood, is going to cause you discomfort. Not because it is uncomfortable, but because the environment, once again, historically, sociologically, anthropologically, and traditionally, has been taught the same way we have been taught. They have been taught that blackness in its fullest and most asserted form is dangerous. Blackness in its fully and most asserted political form, its most politically mobile, its most economically viable, and its most intellectually engaged form, serves to significantly disrupt the idea and the myth of black inferiority. Because that, historically, anthropologically, and sociologically, traditionally, within the United States of America, the myth of black inferiority, whether it be black female inferiority or black male inferiority, has been utilized to supplement the idea of white supremacy. It has been utilized to supplement the idea of multiple other types of oppression. Right? The same 19th century scholars that utilized phrenology, which was the study of skulls, in order to justify dehumanizing black people, the same exact science was utilized to dehumanize white women. Same science. Literally. The scientists who came up with this idea said that white women's skulls were more similar to the skulls of black and non-white and other non-white peoples. Therefore, we have to continuously subdue and control white women, because free white women would mean the end of the white race. The modern tradition of blackness between black men and black women, as Haki Madhubuti says in this book, is that any serious black man needs to engage with black women in such a way where he is learning how to engage with this woman. He is learning how to be in lockstep with this woman. And similarly, black women, any serious black woman, needs to be in lockstep with black men. And lockstep does not mean moving at the same rate. Lockstep does not mean moving at the same pace. Lockstep means understanding that their blackness is just as valid and just as interrupted as your blackness. Black people tend to marry each other at a rate of 83% over a particular threshold of income. Black people below a particular threshold of income, both black men and black women, tend to engage in more white supremacist orientations or values, because once again, they believe that that's how it is that they engage, or that's how it is that we believe that we engage in social mobility. So the modern tradition, what does it look like to reject these things? The modern tradition, what does it look like to radically deject these things? It means to widen your lens on what blackness is, because a lot of us as black people carry anti-black perspectives. A lot of us. Whether it be based in education, whether it be based in income, whether it be based in us behaving outside of the contextualizations of white ideologies, all of these things are anti-black. We need to stop expecting one another to behave in line with behaviors that continue to suppress and oppress us. Bottom line. White is not always right. White man's ice is not no colder than the ice that come out your fridge. right? The rise of intellectualism is rampant, but that has never been, ever, historically, it has never been a black tradition. There has been debate about how it is that intellectualism, or there has been debate about how it is that education can further the cause and further the political mobilization and further the economic independence of black people. But to be anti-intellectual, to not read, to not critically think, has never been a black tradition. Blackness is not equivalent to ghetto. It's not. It is not. To consistently allow ourselves to be perpetuated in such a way where it is on us. Oh, these white folks got this, and these white folks, they control this, this, that. Once again, in this book, Haki Matabuti asks the question, or poses the question, if black as an identifier is a political identifier, should not we as black people be in control of the production thereof? Once again, if black is a political identifier for us as black people, should we as black people not be in control of the production thereof? The modern tradition of blackness as it relates to the relationship between black men and black women should be to protect one another. Should be to be engaged in each other's liberation. Should be to be engaged in each other's radical rejection of white supremacist ideology, internalizing it as somehow aspirationally more effective than blackness. That should be the modern tradition. The modern tradition should be to raise our families in this way. The modern tradition should be to identify how it is that, once again, irrespective of your economic standing, you can aspire to be more economically viable, but that does not determine your worth. We've been there. We've tried that. We were the original tenders of exchange. We were the original insurance policies. We were the original money here. We were. We were the original carriers of capitalism, but we had no control over the means of production because we were the means of production. So to be valued as an object, to objectify others and to objectify ourselves is internalized anti-blackness. That is not our tradition. Our tradition, traditionally, as black people both in the diaspora and here, has been to consistently seek the liberation, the uplift, and the feeding of the community as a whole. To not be in conflict with nature, but to be in communion and harmony with it. To identify God as the all. To identify even the most inanimate objects as worthy. To recognize that everything that exists in harmony has a place. And to say that nobody is disposable simply because they are not behaving in the way that they need to behave right now. They can be taught. They can be led. They can be coached. But once again, if the communication between us as black men and black women is not cohesive, before you fix yourself to check the other, you need to check yourself first. And you need to check and see whether or not you are actually coaching this black person to liberate themselves or to place themselves in a different type of ideological bondage. Good people, great people, God's people. Speaking of checking ourselves first, before we close out and before we go to the next episode next week, right? Y'all join my Patreon because once again, This podcast is brought to you by me. I'm a solo artist out here, y'all. I'm doing this without any help from the record companies, from record labels. I don't got no sponsors, none of that. It's just me out here, right? So, my Patreon is called The Selfish Group, The Selfish Collective, The Selfish Community, right? In this community, I'm teaching you how to stop betraying yourself, how to stop placing yourself underneath other people, how to stop engaging in trauma patterns that remove you from filling your own cup and finally putting you in your healing first, right? You cannot show up to community in your most authentic way if you do not learn how to communicate to the community what it is that you need, right? So within this Patreon, you have live bi-weekly mental wellness masterclasses. You have access to my Selfish course. You have weekly mental health resource drops, and you get members only one-on-one coaching session rates. Inside of my Patreon, my coaching session rates are much lower than they are outside of the Patreon. And once again, I am going to begin taking on one-on-one clients again at the end of 2025. So until that comes to pass, join the Patreon, y'all. Bi-weekly mental wellness masterclasses, and I have priced the Patreon to be very similar to the copay that you would pay in order to get therapy from traditional therapy. Y'all come join a group of people, come join a community who are on the same journey as you in order to understand how to stop attempting to identify one's value is not what it is that they do, but who it is that they are, right? Good people, great people, God's people. Oh, somebody asked me masterclasses on what? Masterclasses on how it is to disrupt particular trauma patterns that are related to overextending yourself to your own detriment, right? So in other words, understanding how it is that the way in which you have been taught or the way in which your trauma has impacted you has caused you to consistently place other people's needs beyond your own, and then reduce the way in which you have learned how to understand your needs, your wants, and your values. How to communicate your needs, your wants, and your values, how to identify your needs, your wants, and your values, how to assert more effective boundaries, how to identify your capacity to engage in community, and then if your capacity is not at the place for you to engage in community, to be able to communicate to others what it is that you need. How it is to identify your particular trauma patterns and disrupt these trauma patterns so that at the end of this journey, you understand how it is to, one, communicate your needs, your wants, and your values, how it is to, two, assert more effective boundaries, and how it is to, three, come back into your respective spaces of community to say, hey, this is what I'm capable of, this is what it is that my capacity is, and this is what it is that it's not. And I would appreciate if you respected that, respected my humanity, and respected my ability to engage at the rate that I'm able to engage, right? That is what the masterclasses are on. So, ladies and gentlemen, good people, great people, God's people, I will see y'all next time, man. Peace, love, soul, and butter rolls. Peace.